Welcome to this talk for the Norfolk Historic Buildings Group. This time I will be showing you some details of 3 buildings in Hempnall which provided surprising results. They were included amongst the houses we surveyed as part of our latest study of the houses of Norfolk. My name is Ian Hinton and I'm Chair of the NHBG. Visit our website nhbg.org.uk for details of how to obtain the research volume of this study. Hempnall is located about 10 miles south of Norwich. It was a rich and important ville at the time of Domesday, based on the core of an Anglo-Saxon estate. But its position declined significantly over the next 300 to 400 years, but it retained more than 200 acres of woodland right through until the 19th century. A non-resident lord of the manor and a reduction in manorial control meant that parts of the manorial domain land were being sold off to the local yeoman farmers in the 16th century. This allowed those yeomen to increase their holdings, enabling them to gain wealth, which meant that they could build the houses that still exist today, which we were able to survey as part of this project. This map shows the land use of Hempnall at around 1500. It is derived from the manorial records by Mo Cubitt and by subsequent landscape analysis. The remaining common land at this time is shown coloured ochre. The strips of Vicar's glebe land are shown in blue and are scattered throughout what remains of the open fields, which are shown in dark brown. The lighter brown areas were arable land that had already been privately enclosed, in many cases by residents of the red dots, which are houses and tenements that were mentioned in the manor records of the 14th century, so were already well established. Perhaps most importantly, unlike in many Norfolk parishes, the dark green shows the woodland that still existed in 1500. The larger woodland area to the south of the parish was originally a deer park. In all, we surveyed about 40 houses in Hempnall, these 18 in the town itself, and the remainder scattered around the greens, mainly to the south of the parish. Most of them turned out to be what they appeared to be from the outside, although a few did prove to be altered and extended late 15th or early 16th century open hall houses, but the 3 buildings we are going to see here turned out to be a complete surprise. On the face of it, these buildings present as 2 19th century cottages and a garage. The red dots here show the 16th to 18th century properties we were invited to survey for this project, and those in blue were those we did not manage to see inside. Starting with Cotlon, which was formerly known as Chapel View, which in itself is a late name as the eponymous chapel was a 19th century Methodist one. Unusually for Hempnall, this property was held freehold, so there are no manorial records to consult. It had about 1.5 acres of land and was an early 18th century butcher's shop, and located slightly away from the centre of Hempnall. Cotlon appears to be a pair of brick-built cottages with a central chimney stack and an additional gable-end stack at the western end. But there are fabric breaks in the brickwork. The horizontal one above which the bricks change slightly in colour and the bonding shifts to a different form of Flemish bond, still with alternating headers and stretchers, but where the headers are above each other. And to the right of the vertical line, there is another change to a far more regular appearance. This was the house when we first saw it in 2013. But this was the house in 1986, when photographed by the local historian Mo Cubitt, who wrote a village history. The windows and doors remain the same, but this explains the vertical fabric break in the wall. This photo from the 1890s in the owner's possession shows a completely different picture. When we first saw it, it appeared to have been reversed when printed, with the gable end stack at the eastern end rather than at the western end. And again, the door and downstairs windows match those in the house today. A thatched 1.5-storey pair of cottages, This explains the horizontal fabric break seen today as the eaves were raised. Investigations inside indicated that this was a more likely original form, a three-celled 1.5-storey house which was divided into two cottages later, requiring the gable end stack at the eastern end to heat the second unit. The floor plan displays the transitional layout between the open hall house with the cross passage at the low end of the hall and the later closed house with an off-centre chimney stack and the external entrance into the lobby by the stack. The opposed entry doors here, indicated by the two black arrows, are adjacent to the hall's service room wall. The scale of the building is smaller than that of houses of this form usually found in Norfolk, being slightly less than 4 metres wide internally, that's 13 feet. The service bay is 2.6 metres long, 9 feet, and the hall 3.6 metres long, 12 feet. The stack takes up most of the width of the house. Remnants of the timber frame in the rear wall of the house suggest an original timber-framed building with the front wall replaced completely in brick. Most of the gable end wall was similarly replaced and the parlour replaced by another cottage. It is not possible to suggest when this might have happened or indeed whether the changes were contemporary. In the following photos, the direction of the photo is shown by the red arrow on the floor plan. So we start by looking at the service rooms. Here we see a single doorway rather than the usual pair, and the door to the right opens onto a steep, straight staircase for upstairs access. This is the pattern we found in 4 other houses in Hempnall, including here at Lime Tree Cottage, albeit somewhat larger, and with 2 service doors in the centre and the stairs to the right. Looking across the service bay to the stairs, the steepness of the stairs can be seen, and the rather strange off-centre position of the principal joist is explained as the trimming joist supporting the head of the stairs. In the north wall of the hall, the other door of the opposed pair shows on the left. It was not possible to investigate the anchorage of the principal joist in the north wall, as all the principals have been pine-clad. This wall is still timber-framed as it sits inside the earliest part of the lean-to at the rear. The width of the stack in relation to the room is noticeable. Although part of the bread oven to the left has been rebuilt, the lower courses are continuous, and the passage past the stack with the door in it is only 75 centimetres wide, that's 2'6". There is no visible timber upstairs, but the right-hand section of the lean-to back house, with the smaller windows, is older. Inside it has 2 rustic principal rafters with short struts supporting the purlin. Moving on to the second surprise at Spring Mead. This was the house for 3 tenements from the 16th century onwards, according to the manor records: Westons, Pipistraws and Garbolds. It is located towards the western end of the street, close to the likely position of the fairground. It is the garage for a 1990s built house. We did not consider looking at this building until the owner attended one of our talks about the project to villagers and said that there were some old timbers inside. It was once a larger building that was truncated when the land was divided and the neighbouring house built in the 1970s. The part with the tiled roof is the parlour end of a 3-celled house, or is one room of a 2-celled house, and the white wall to the left is the original stack bay. Inside, the western gable end looks like this, with a sizable cranked brace pegged into the deep jowl of the corner post. The jowl was once 1.2 metres, that's 4 feet long, and is of a gunstock form. All the remaining timbers in the rest of the building are equally grandly sized. In the opposite corner is a gently inverse arched brace, but it springs from an equally deeply jowled corner post. This is an unusual view of the chamfered back of a mantel beam seen from inside the stack. The angle of the chamfer can be seen by comparing it with the vertical face of the beam to the left, which is arrowed. The brickwork above the mantel has been rebuilt as it is now the external wall of this part of the building. The inside of the stack also shows the rounded side of a bread oven. The wall above here has also been rebuilt. The transverse principal joist is 28 centimetres across and has a large plain chamfer more than 8 centimetres wide, which is terminated by a large shield stop, the step and curve of which can just be seen, with the remainder buried inside the brick wall. Along its length are a series of mortices for diminished haunch tenons for the common joists, which appear to have been flat laid. The original ceiling level has been retained for the garage's eaves level, and apart from the gable end and the principal joist, parts of 2 story posts and a brace remain in the rear brick wall. Whether this was a 3 or 2-celled house, the size of the timbers points to a house of some quality, just about hanging on now as an outhouse. We only surveyed one definite 2-celled house of this period for this study, and that was in neighbouring Wootton. All the houses in Hempnall were of 3 cells. Stored inside is a door frame made of substantial timbers with a plain one-piece spandrel. It was built into the front wall when the current owners moved in, now replaced by one of the garage doors, so it has no provenance and seems to be too early for this building. Seen from the front, the frame is nicely chamfered, but the whole is rather weather damaged. The third surprise was Wilfrid's cottage. The site was first mentioned in the manorial records of 1393 as a house lived in by the vicar. It is close to the church, and the vicar probably lived here in the 1640 until the 1640s, when we know he occupied another house in the village before being sequestered for anti-Commonwealth preaching in 1646. It was divided into 2 shops in the 1770s. It can be seen here how close it is to the church. It appears to be a symmetrically laid out 19th century cottage with painted rough cast render, a central doorway and a gable end stack. It forms part of the street frontage of the street, with a gap to its west end to allow access to the commercial properties behind. This house has been a holiday let and Airbnb rental for some time. We never managed to arrange internal access. The building is not listed, and I have the feeling the owners were scared that our findings could cause them problems. However, Mo Cubitt, when researching for her history of the village, published in 2008, managed to take a few photographs of the interior when it was undergoing a complete renovation in the 1980s. Recently, we've been able to use these photos to investigate the building's construction, although some features, which only became significant in this analysis, were not photographed at the time. These images are scans of her original pictures, though in some cases detail is lacking. Again, it is a timber-framed building built with substantial timbers. The door here appears to be in its original position between 2 story posts adjacent to an internal wall. This is the original wall plate level, so it is another 1.5 story building with a later eaves raise. The brick front wall has replaced all but the principal frame timbers. The joists in this cell can be seen to rest on an inserted clamp, which is not part of the original frame, which sits parallel to it and supported by a brace. So this floor has been inserted into an open hall. This detail will be seen again later. The original tie beam, which was part of the hall service room wall, has been cut through to allow access around the upstairs after the floor was inserted over the hall. The second jowled story post adjacent to the door must have been the anchor point for a form of screen for the cross passage, as it performs no other function in the building. Looking at the gable end wall in the service bay, the plinth is predominantly of flint in the northern half, and the brick cladding has been laid on edge. The southern half of this wall has been completely rebuilt in brick. The size of the flat laid joists here should be noted. Looking into the service bay from the outside, the clamp for the hall ceiling support can again be seen clearly. At the opposite end in the west is the chimney stack, which does not fit into its bay, as we will see more clearly later. It sits behind a large principal joist which is supporting some of the floor joists, which again is not part of the original frame. The original frame is represented by the large brace springing from the story post, which is matched by one on the other side. These support a beam cut off near both ends. We have interpreted this as the bressumer for a smoke bay. We found 3 other 4-foot wide bays in open hall houses in Hempnall, one at a gable end, one between 2 cells, and a third as part of a rebuilt service end whilst building in the smoke bay. The rear of this narrow bay shows faintly as a stud and tie beam some 1.5 metres further back. The remainder of this wall has been built in brick, seen on the right behind the stack. Was this the original end of the building, or just the rear of the smoke bay with the brick appearing later? Seen from further back, the same features appear. But in this photo, the size and variable nature of the original common joists over the service bay can be compared to the smaller, cleaner versions inserted in the hall. Returning to the first photo, it can be compared to a modern photo taken from the cottage rental website. The door here is no longer in use. Also from the cottage rental site, this photo shows the gap between the stack and the inserted support for the common joists, which is separate and behind the original frame, with its large brace springing from the story post. Also from this story post is a longitudinal brace, indicating that there's probably more than to this building to the west, because if the smoke bay was at the end of the building, a corner brace would have sprung from the corner post and faced the opposite way. The brick gable end can be seen to wrap round by about 75 centimetres. The tie beam seen in this wall inside at the original eaves level, as well as the longitudinal brace, suggests this was a later feature. This photo from the late 19th century shows the remainder of the house, which was demolished in the 1970s to allow access to the properties behind. It is not known when the property was split into 2, but the demolished part seen here has a different roof angle and eaves level, but the photo quality is not good enough to see any more detail. Given that the demolition of this part occurred in the 1970s, it seems reasonable assumption that the brick gable was part of that process. Our interpretation of these photographs of Wilfrid's cottage suggests that this was a 1.5-storey open hall house of 3 cells, with a smoke bay between the hall and the parlour, or possibly just a 2-celled open hall with a smoke bay at the western end and no parlour. At some time around the end of the 16th or early 17th century, a brick stack was built inside the smoke bay and the hall floored over, creating a hall chamber which required the low tie beams to be cut off to facilitate movement. Possibly at the same time, or maybe later, the eaves were raised to create more headroom upstairs. and in the 1970s the parlour end, if there was one, rather than it being a separate building, was demolished, resulting in the building we see today. Given the features uncovered, a likely smoke bay, a likely cross-passage screen, the flint plinth, and the size of the timbers involved, it seems reasonable to assume that this house probably dated from the early 16th century and maybe even earlier. It is in a prominent position in town, had a prominent resident, both of which would reflect on its quality of construction. More photographs would have helped, but without these photographs from the 1980s by Mo Cubitt, we would not have been able even to speculate about this building, would probably have agreed with the external assessment that it was a 19th century cottage. The 40 houses we surveyed in Hempnall resulted in some surprises by uncovering earlier origins or specific features, but none produced surprises as great as these 3 buildings, which were most definitely not as they originally seemed. Research volume detailing these and other houses in the study, as well as an historical analysis, is available via our website. Thank you for listening.